Hello and welcome to the Lehigh Valley Passport to History Winter Series. Even though it's about 80 degrees outside today, I hope everyone was able to get outside and get some sunshine, and maybe you even are right now. My name is George Wacker. I'll be your host for this evening. Every month, the Lehigh Valley Passport to History series brings you a different theme and discussion. Lehigh Valley Passport to History is a partnership of historic sites and resources in and around Pennsylvania's Lehigh and Northampton counties. Let their group connect you with historical activities, events, tours, and exhibitions throughout the valley. You want to head to their website, which you're looking at right now, lvhistory.org. From museums to research archives to little-known architectural gems off the beaten path. If you want to find something really interesting in Lehigh Valley, especially after a day like today, when you're really motivated to get out there, hit up Lehigh Valley Passport to History. This evening, we are celebrating National Women's History Month with some really interesting stories and some fantastic images. I'm really excited to share them. We'll be joined tonight by the Moravian Historical Society, the Boyertown Museum of Historical Vehicles, and the National Museum of Industrial History to learn about pioneering female leaders and innovations that brought about changes during 3 centuries of Lehigh Valley history. And enough from me. Victoria, how are you?
Good. How are you, George?
Great. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'll give you a little bit of an introduction. Victoria Starbuck is the Collections Assistant and Education Coordinator for the Moravian Historical Society, and she's going to be talking about some extraordinary Moravian women and how they influenced education in the 1700s. So I'm going to let you take it from here.
All right. So as George mentioned, I'm talking a bit about how Moravians influence education, particularly looking at how Moravians of various races and economic backgrounds were encouraged to obtain their full potential, and how education, leadership, and autonomy were fostered among the early Lehigh Valley settlers. Both women's education and leadership opportunities in these Moravian communities during the 1700s rivaled that of men's. And some of the key points from Moravian women's experiences are that just 2 years after the Moravians arrived in the region, they had established a girls' school at Germantown. They remained there briefly before moving to Bethlehem, and they had a short stint in Nazareth before returning to Bethlehem. And if anyone can guess what I'm talking about, what it is today, it is Moravian College. From the outset, there was little difference between girls' and boys' education. Their curriculums were almost identical to each other. Women of an older age, held leadership positions within choirs, which are the cohorts based on age, gender, and marital status. Beyond leading their individual groups, they also held leadership positions within local churches and internationally as well. And all of this is built on the idea that women had no preset path that defined their marital status or what their role in life should be. And so opportunities to flourish in almost all aspects of life were encouraged from a young age. Entering the early years, about 18 months. Do you have a question, George?
No, I was just coming back in. Keep going.
Okay. Just wanted to make sure. Entering the early years at about 18 months, all the way up to 4 years old, both girls and boys were in nurseries. One of those nurseries is actually this lovely place that George is showing you that is now home to the Moravian Historical Society. And in those places, both the young boys and girls together would learn the hymns of the church and learn to behave in church services. Moving on now, though, to girls' education more specifically, girls would move into, from that 4 years old all the way up to about 17 or 19 years of age, to be in a girls' school. And as you can see on the screen, this is an image of that seminary down in Bethlehem. Now, in Bethlehem in the 1750s, there was a 100% literacy rate across gender, race, age, and enslaved status. So this indicates the extent to which education was supported for people of both genders at the time and of all social groups. Um, Often the curriculum would include spelling, reading, writing in English and German, grammar, math, astronomy. I could list on and on, but that might bore you a bit, so I'll stop. But elsewhere, outside of Moravian communities, girls were only learning needlework, type of industrial crafts. Whereas here, they were learning the exact same thing as the boys, also learning things such as botany and painting. An aspect of both girls' and boys' education that was appealing to outsiders was that instead of using catechisms in their lessons, they avoided those. While there were some Christian components to the education, they used primers that were modern primers of the day. So in 1785, the schools, both the boys' school and the girls' school, opened to non-Moravians. Young women who were learning all sorts of things, as I've mentioned, would often learn trades in the single sisters' house, where there were weaving looms and other such types of tools used for industrial purposes. Girls with gifts for music had private tutoring sessions and were expected, should they prove to be particularly good at singing or playing an instrument, to perform at church services, and then later on in life take the role of their tutor and tutor another young girl. Now, I've just mentioned the single sisters house, so I'll take a minute to pause a bit for the choirs. I think I've explained them a little bit earlier, but rephrase that those are social groups based on age, gender, and marital status. And in the Moravian communities, there were houses where you would live with your choir group. So a very particular group was that of the single sisters, who were unmarried women of a marrying age. And this is in the 1700s, during a time when unmarried women were not finding themselves able to be economically, financially independent from others.
Yeah, I was going to ask, is in the Moravian community, it was women of all wealth, too. It wasn't just the rich women, it was all women who were being educated. Is that correct?
Right. So, yes, it was all. The Moravians had something called a general economy, where if you contributed through work to the community, say you had a skill like weaving, you wouldn't get a pay, but instead you would get room and board, and you'd be cared for from birth till death. And of course, there were exceptions for people who were unable to work, or like of a certain age, or with like physical disabilities, who couldn't manage that. But yes, in all types of economic backgrounds. The woman who established what is now Moravian College, Benigna von Zinzendorf, she was a countess. Whereas you would find, people who had been born into the community where they didn't necessarily have family wealth. You also had different racial groups, though they did constitute a minority. There were African American women. I think there was a woman from Guinea.
Native Americans too, right?
Yeah.
As well,
yeah. Mohican, Delaware, and Wampanoag, from what I remember. And they were all living in that same single sisters house. So it was those women, as well as women from various different European countries. The majority of them came from Germany, but there still is that intercultural mix that you wouldn't really expect to find at that time, especially on the Pennsylvania frontier.
Sure. And it's a shame to give 10 to 12 minutes to this topic, because the women's history in the Moravian community is vast, and of course the Moravian Historical Society is a place where you can find more information about it. What are you doing now? Do you have any events going on? How can people find out more information about what you're doing?
Yes, so I think the easiest way to find out information about what we're doing is to follow us on Facebook at Moravian Historical Society. We also have an Instagram at Moravian History, and our website is moravianhistory.org. We do have some events coming up. We have a virtual event in, I think it's this month actually, in a couple of weeks, on the archaeological dig on the site that occurred a couple of years ago, and that's by the curator. And then I'll be talking more about one of the Moravian sisters, Anna Rosina Kleist, in April, and her contributions to American botanical history.
All right, so we'll make sure that people follow you, and of course you can find out more information if you head to lvhistory.org. You can click right over to Moravian Historical Society. Victoria, thank you so much. Unfortunately, we have to move on to Kendra, but thank you so much. We'll talk to you again in a few minutes. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, it's fine. I was just saying thank you.
All right, there's so much to get through here, and I'm going to move along as quickly as I can without rushing. This is my first repeat person, I think. Kendra Cook, the curator and manager of the Boyertown Museum of Historic Vehicles, excuse me. She's going to speak about how the bicycle impacted women's lives in the 1800s. Just bear with me for one moment. Kendra, hello.
Hi.
How are you? Wow. I still talk about the last time we spoke and you showed me that crazy old GPS thing.
Yes.
I still tell people about. I Googled that as soon as we got off.
Good.
It was so much fun.
Thank you. Thank you for spreading the word. I appreciate it.
I don't want to waste anybody's time. There's some really interesting images that go along with this as well. So I'm going to let you take over, and I'm going to share some photos as you do.
Sure. First I'm going to start with a quote that we use a lot at the museum that Susan B. Anthony wrote in 1896. I think the bicycle has done more to emancipate women than any one thing in the world. So that's some encouraging words from someone on this topic. And I'll let you throw the first image up there because I'm going to talk a little bit about what bicycles used to look like before the 1880s. That's called an ordinary bicycle, which looks anything but ordinary, but that was really what was pretty common in the 1870s and into the 1880s. And before this, they were even more primitive. But these were a very rough ride. They were also sometimes called bone shakers. There is a reason for the large wheel, and that was so the rider could use his body weight to help turn the pedals, because that was a problem. We don't have chains on our bikes yet. And you notice I said the rider used his weight. That's because women were not riding those high wheel bicycles. If you think in the 1870s, we're in the Victorian era, women are wearing full ankle length skirts. There's no way they're going to be able to ride something like that. And it's just unseemly. So in the 1880s, we come up with something called the safety bicycle. And that's similar to what we would ride today. So that's two wheels of the same size and the chain drive, and also pneumatic or air-filled tires. So this is a much nicer ride, a much smoother ride, and men actually don't really like this safety bicycle at first. It's kind of looked down upon, but the women really kind of glom onto it like right away. So as you can see, that's a ladies model bicycle that we have at the museum. So these are going to be better accommodating to ladies' skirts, for one thing. It has the swooping frame there. That's to accommodate all the skirts and everything. You will see there is a wood box, and it's hard to tell in this photo, around the chain. That's a chain guard. That's to keep those flowing fabrics out of the moving pieces. And there on the left, you'll see a wooden fender skirt. And you see there's all these strings that are tied from that fender to the hub. That's to keep skirts out of the moving spokes. That's what that's for. So I'll get back to the seat later. But this was a big deal because now women did not have to rely on men for travel, and particularly women of middle or lower class social status. A wealthy woman might be able to afford, the carriages and the horses, because horses also need to be stabled and fed and all that. So there's a lot of expense there. So now we have women with less money are now able to travel a little more freely. So of course there's trolleys and streetcars at this time too, but there's actually some pushback on women riding those, because now we have, women who are supposed to be proper and Victorian are crammed into these streetcars with men who maybe just got off work at the factory. That's unseemly back in the Victorian era. And of course, there was a lot of mixture as far as, different races were riding the trolley. That's not really acceptable either. Victorian times, it was really proper to kind of stay within your social sphere, so to speak. So the bicycle, so it gets them out of the trolley. They have a little more freedom. You're not beholden to when the trolley runs and where the stops are. But also, it allows women to join political and social and educational groups. The suffragette movement is really going to start to kick up. Here's a way for them to get involved in that. The temperance movement, we're coming up, prohibition's coming in a few years, really. So there's another movement, social movement that women are getting involved in, and the bicycle's helping them do that. And of course, meeting people unlike themselves. I think I had a photo in there, an illustration in there too, of a man and woman. That's from sales literature from the Acme Bicycle Company. And this starts to break down some of the strict courting rules as well. We have a web series at the museum, and we just did an episode on how the car really kind of changed our society from courting to dating, but the bicycle started that kind of slide down there. So that's a couple things. Then you also have something called the rational dress movement. Women don't want to be riding around with these bicycles and big skirts, even though the safety ones are better accommodating to those. So then we start getting this rejection of the full skirts, the corsets. You don't want to be wearing all these tight, restricting clothes when you're doing physical activity. So we come out with things called bloomers, which are these baggy trousers are kind of cinched at the knee. The rational dress movement just wants to go, quote, against the introduction of any fashion in dress that either deforms the figure, impedes the movement of the body, or in any way tends to injure the health. So you see a couple of bicycles in that little ad there for bloomers. And, the bike really kind of kickstarted that because it just wasn't practical, and women wanted a practical wardrobe for riding their bikes, which were becoming extremely popular. And there's some interesting women involved in this too. I don't have any photos of her tonight, but there was a woman in the 1890s who bicycled around the world. Her name was Annie Londonderry. Her real name was Annie Kupchovsky, and she was a Lithuanian immigrant. She lived in a tenement in New York City, and she basically took this challenge on to bicycle around the globe, and it got her a lot of fame and fortune, celebrity status there at the time. And, she found a way to use the bicycle. Really a very poor woman an immigrant was able to use the bike to sort of, propel herself into some fortune there.
I was looking at this photo. If you look in the bottom corner, do you see that lady's carrying that? I want to see one of those. That looks very dangerous.
Oh, we have
any of those in the museum?
Car seats for cars in our time.
That is really so fascinating to see how that autonomy, goes into different areas. Political, from transportation, affecting that. So
yeah. And of course there was pushback. I mean, a lot of people didn't like this, and I have that photo up there of the seat, the bicycle seat. It's interesting. So when this lady's bike that we got, I'd say about 8 years ago, and if you can go back to there you go. You can see it really well. So we got this bicycle, and you'll see the saddle, or the seat. The saddle has that hole cut out in the middle with the ties across it. And we figured, we didn't have a lady's bike before. We figured this was like ventilation, how they ventilate athletic gear, the batters' helmets, people's running shirts. You always see ventilation and stuff. We figured that's what that was. Oh no, that is not what that was. That there was a very real fear that basically bicycles would replace men for women, that women would be stimulated by a bicycle and no longer need a man. This was a very real fear and a little scare tactic they put out there. So they came up with what they called hygienic seats, or sometimes they're called anatomical seats. And that ad you threw up there was for one of them. And it basically, they try to code, and we've seen a bunch of ads like this. They try to code it as, this is going to keep your insides from getting all jumbled and crushed. I mean, you see like the fake X-ray type drawing in there, which is, this is like typical Victorian kind of pseudoscience that they're using here. And, they're basically saying, we don't want the women to get hurt on these bicycles, but that wasn't really the purpose of that. The purpose was so that they felt this would not stimulate the lady riders and they wouldn't abandon men, basically.
You learn new things every day. I did not know that.
We were, like I said, we just thought that was like ventilation, let air move freely. And no, it's not that innocent. No,
not close.
No, not at all.
Definitely, we could talk more about this subject. But we need, again, I want to make sure that you get to plug yourself as well before we move on, because this stuff is fascinating. I want to come visit when we're able to. All the stuff that you bring on is so great. So how can people find out more information?
Yeah, so we have a website, .org. And we have a very, very, very active Facebook page. And we also have a relatively new YouTube channel. And every Friday from tomorrow till the end of April, at least, we will have new content up there every Friday. So all different topics, including courting and how the car affected that. So there you go.
All right, we're looking forward to it. And unfortunately, again, stick around, but we are moving on. Thank you so much.
Yep.
Andrea, thank you so much for being so patient. This always happens. We always say, hey, we're going to do 10 minutes and 10 minutes. And then we start talking because all these things are interesting and we're learning new things. So George, thank you for hanging out.
Thank you so much. And this has been a fascinating program thus far.
And we're not done yet because you have so many photos here. I want to make sure that I get the right thing out here. So I just want to introduce you first before you begin, and then I'll let you go. Andrea Azaya, the curator of collections at the National Museum of Industrial History, is going to talk about how women in the early 1900s helped shape our modern workday. I am going to do my best to follow along with these fascinating pictures, or at least 20 of them or so. Take it away.
Sounds good, George. Thank you so much. So there is a direct correlation between the involvement of women in protest movements and the success rates of those campaigns. And industrial reform was no different. So let's take a look at what women were able to do in that movement to sort of usher in this new way of doing things that we can be very grateful for today. So women were were involved in trying to better working conditions as early as the 1830s and the 1840s. And in 1881, there was the Atlanta washerwomen's strike. But there was really something that pushed the needle forward, and it was the 1912 Bread and Roses strike. And that really did quite a lot to make this happen. There are some images here of some young women who were undoubtedly involved in the strike at the time too. So the protest was led largely by young women, and it was influenced by what was going on regionally at the time. And then in turn, it influenced what was happening down here, even in the Lehigh Valley. So let's head up to Lawrence, Massachusetts and look at what kind of unrest was boiling over. It was also called the Singing Strike or the Bread and Roses Strike. There was a poem that was written by James Oppenheim, and I'm just going to read the very end of it because this was published about a month before this strike started. So as we come marching, we bring the greater days. The rising of the women means the rising of the race. No more drudge and idler, tend that toil where one reposes, but a sharing of life's glories, bread and roses, bread and roses. So they knew what was important to sort of work for and to fight for at the time. So the year prior, in 1911, we had seen the most disastrous industrial fire in New York City history. It was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire where 146 garment workers were lost. So the workers in all of these textile mills knew the dangers of what they were facing. So in 1912, in Lawrence, there were about 35,000 workers. This was a huge industrial center producing about 25% of our nation's woolens and textiles. And you can see here in this picture, these are the average workers that we would have had in the mill. Half of the workers were teenagers. And these conditions in the mill, they were grim, long hours. There's lint and dust all through the air. These workers were not paid a living wage. The water was so contaminated that supervisors actually sold bottled water to the workers. And in 1905, they instituted a kind of a new idea that these workers, each weaver would be in charge of not one loom, but 2 looms at a time. And that was in the woolen mills. In the cotton mills, it was much more difficult because one worker would be responsible for 12 separate pieces of equipment, 12 separate machines at one time. So this was a really difficult life. And if you could go back to that image of the family sitting there, and this sort of gives us an idea of what life was like, what average life was like for a family, a working class family at the time. So according to a US Bureau of Labor report, this area had one of the highest death rates in the country. There were a considerable number of young boys and girls who died within the first 2 or 3 years after they began working at the mill. 36% of the workers before the time they were 25 years of age passed away. The average life expectancy for a mill worker was 39 years. And this was 22 years less than that of the owners. So you can see this real disparity happening. So why these bleak figures? What was going on here? By the time the 1880s came along, new technology is now instituted in the mills, and they're bringing people over from abroad. They're giving them lower wages. So this was, again, this industrial powerhouse, and the textile workers on average made less than, and this was supervisors and office people, less than $9 a week. There was a study that the lowest livable wage that for human conditions was about $8 and 28 cents a week. Not everyone worked a full week. So to give you another idea, the regular family in Lawrence or a third of them, actually learned less than $7 for the whole family a week. So while this area is producing more cloth than anywhere in the country and is a real world industrial powerhouse for the textile industry, a lot of these workers couldn't afford to purchase a coat, and malnutrition was very common. So on the first of the year, it's 1912, there was the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire that had happened in March of 1911. James Oppenheim releases the Bread and Roses poem. And on the first of the year in 1912, Massachusetts cuts hours, cuts pay. There was a group of Polish women at the Everett Mill. They opened up their envelope, their pay, and they said, "We've been shortchanged, we're out of here." They walked out. The next day, there were other workers at a woolen mill. They also saw that they were short pay. So they started marching, short pay, all out, short pay, all out. And then within days, you have 20,000 workers picketing all around the city. And they're singing while they marched. And at first, some of the American-born workers crossed over those protest lines and started working. But then after 3 weeks, this protest kept growing and growing. It was so successful that even those workers joined in the strike. The mill workers tried to disguise what was going on inside, and they kept the machines running, even though no cloth was being made. So who were these people? Who were these strikers? 65% of them lived in the US for less than 10 years. 47% for less than 5 years. These were new immigrants, and they were coming to work at the mills from Russia, Turkey, Syria, England, everywhere in between, and to find, work at the mills. So they're experiencing this from January until March. They striked, and they were then joined by the International Workers of the World, the IWW. One of the she was kind of a feminist and an activist leader. There she is. And she's just one of the many women who played a huge role in the Bread and Roses strike. So she was very much also involved in helping children strike and raising awareness to child's labor as well. So workers from all around the country, from other cities, all up and down the eastern seaboard, were really interested in what was going to happen in Lawrence, what was going to happen in the Bread and Roses strike. They met every day, they had meetings. It eventually came to an end on March 12th of 1912. And the American Woolen Company agreed to most of the worker demands, and they were able to go back to work. So initially great, and here's an image of some of those waiting to hear news from New York City of what was happening up in Lawrence. And it really kind of fueled the fire. Children were marching as well. So great strides were really made at first. They lost many of those gains over the next couple of years. What ended up happening is that there were labor spies. Some of the strikers who were involved were not promoted, while others who were not involved were promoted. So they were discriminated against. But the fact that people from all over the country were really looking to Lawrence to see what was going on, and here's an image from 1926, Passaic textile strike, really got the ball rolling here. But the fact that they were really looking to see what was happening here caused this great swell in confidence for the American labor movement. So before the Bread and Roses strike, before 1912, conservative trade unions thought that women, and much less immigrant women, could not organize. But this blew all of that out of the water, and they really proved them wrong, because they shut down the largest mill, one of the largest mill complexes in the world. So the effects of labor reform, this 5-day workday, child labor, mandatory education, Labor Day, workers' compensation, and really women had such a key role in and doing that for all of us. This is from, I wanted to add this in here because I wanted to kind of come back to Allentown. This is from the 1933 Allentown baby strike that happened. So garment workers, mostly children, they were then influenced. They had the power, the momentum is going, and they went on strike. 400 of them marched to Harrisburg, to the governor's house, and they were demanding better pay, safer worker conditions, and not having to work as many hours. There's a young woman on the right there. Her name is Anna Miletix. She was 15 years old in this image. She used to pack shirts in boxes for 9 cents an hour. And she earned, for 8 days, $3.50. But in her paycheck, she was charged 10% and 2 cents as a check tax. So that kind of gives you an idea of, how dire that situation was for garment workers, even in Pennsylvania 20 years after that. So, the Bread and Roses strike at the beginning of the 20th century really launches, there was an underestimation of the power of what women could do, what workers could do. And this really shutting down this huge textile complex really launches this whole movement, American labor movement, and ushering in all of these changes that we see then in the 20th century. So that by the time that World War II is over, 1946, we see some of the real new movement in strikes and, emerging. So we have the steel workers and unionizing, and in the garment industry and all the industries really kind of coming together. So they were very much lifted up by this Bread and Roses strike from the early 20th century.
Thank you so much. I hope I did justice with those slides. There's so many, they're so interesting. I wish I could have left them on screen longer for everybody. I'm sure you could play this back and watch them again, or I'm sure you can tell people how they can find out more about the National Museum of Industrial History.
Yes, if you are interested in learning more about women in industry, about the textile industry, and about the labor reform movement, please come visit us at the National Museum of Industrial History. We are on the Steel Stacks campus, or you can go to our website at nmih.org.
Okay, and I want to take a second to bring everybody back in. I hope you're ready. I did give you a warning. All right. Thank you guys so much. This was so much fun. It's always a little chaotic, which is what makes it fantastic. I wanted to thank you for teaching me and educating everybody a little bit today. I know we only had about 40 minutes here, but like I was saying with Kendra, a lot of the stuff even I've been hearing has been encouraging me to kind of go learn a little bit more on my own about it. So I hope that other people can do that as well and learn more about your individual organizations. Okay.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you guys. I hope you have a fantastic evening. And again, go to lvhistory.org. It's kind of your one-stop shop to find out more about all these separate organizations. So if you guys just hold on quick, but we'll say goodbye to the live stream, and everybody have a great evening. Thank you so much.
Thanks.